Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol nihiyeh b'dvarei.
Amen.
Okay, good morning. Good morning to everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's supposed to have a special dear friend, Reb Shimon Meyer, all the way from Lakewood, joining us this morning, and a beautiful surprise. And it's great to have Mendy back with us as well. As we jump back in to our journey through Sefer Likutei Moharan, we're going to try our best to complete tzarich of test today. We're going to do our best. And it's a privilege to continue this journey together. Today's shir is sponsored in schus for Refuah Shlema for Yoel Zakai ben Devara Etel, who's having major surgery today. And for the Geula Shlema, B'ez Hashem, everything should go smoothly and well for Yoel Zakai. The schus of our learning together, also sponsored by Jason Kaplan in honor of his parents Martin and Judith Kaplan and his wife's parents Avinoam and Faye Sharabi, also sponsored anonymously b'schus Shidduchim for Klal Yisrael's singles and b'schus Yitzchak Gedalyah ben Ilanit and Ilanit bas Miriam, also sponsored by Zev Klein Linishmas, his parents Rivka Bryndel bas Tzvi Simcha and Ya'akov ben Yesha'Yahu. Our learning should be a schus for all the names mentioned. B'ez Hashem, Yasher Koyach. Okay. So let's jump back in. Here we are on page Mem Aleph, where we had ended off yesterday with the Rebbe explaining to us how wine fits into the whole picture over here, the iyyun of dam, Zacha Nasa Roish, which is the iyyun of Shemiras HaBris, which is the iyyun of Moichin being B'Shleimus, being able to see the world through the consciousness of Emunah, or Loi Zacha Nasa Rosh, which was the flip side of that if a person doesn't have that area mitukan and a person isn't working on that, so then that causes parnasa b'toirach, and that's the iyyun of masa umatan shaloi be'emunah, which is the aspect, like we learned yesterday, of the chacham, as opposed to the tam, the person who's never happy with what one has, the opposite of shakai, where shakai is misha amar lamai dai, wherein a person is able to taste the fullness of the Ein Sof, which is called sheyesh dai be'lukusi l'kula beria. This was the aspect of pirud between kutcha b'richu, which is kol, which is the allness, the fullness, right? We said kol can't even be expressed. It's just it's beyond us, right? It's where the whole infinite abundance, kiviyachol, right, of godliness is sourced, and then the Shechina, which is the realm of tzimtzum, the realm of Dibbur. And the ability to separate chas v'shalom between the two, when a person is not in the iyyun of masa matan be'emunah, and a person is in Bris Mamon, but when a person is in masa matan be'emunah, then there's a yichud kutcharichu shchinte, and then whatever little a person is able to have, it's not with pressure. A person tastes the fullness of what they have when they have it, and then they move forward bit by bit, but without this iyyun of parnasa b'toirach. Instead, it's parnasa b'li toirach. And they're able to taste the iyyun of, like Ya'akov Avinu, who said yeshli kol, right? And the Rosh Tevis yeshli kol, we said, is kli, and therein also lies the two aspects of shakai. Misha amar lo lamai dai is the kli, right? That every person only ever has a chelek. That's the iyyun of sameach b'chelkai. That's a limitation. That's the kli. And then yeshli kol is to taste the allness, right? Which is the aspect of kutchabrichu within the realm of the Shechina, and that's Yaakov Avinu, who is associated with Hakol Kol Yaakov, because he's able to channel down that allness of Kutcharichu down into the vessels which are limited, which is our experience in this realm of the Shechina. So that's what we learned yesterday. Then we put it into a pasuk, that when a person's avonos are avruroshi, which means that they start to impact the moichin, which is loizach and asaraish, which is the aspect of goizel, aviv, imai, right? In other words, they impact the aviv and the imai, the av and aim, abba, ima, which is the aspect of chachma and bina. Then what happens? Kemasa, it's like a big burden, kaved yichbadu mimeni, where kavod, which is the word yichbedu, when you take away the yud, right, seen as just a prefix. So those next four letters, if you scramble them, spell kaved. Kemase kaved yichbedu mimeni. Kaved kavod, which is the aspect of Baruch Shem kavod malchusai, which is yichud kuchrichu shchinte, and the garment of this world being translucent and white, and where there's yichud between the husband and wife kiviyachol. That turns into kaved. Kaved is malei dam, and that's dam nida. That's the separation between the two. Okay? And that is rectified in masa, although that's the issue of kemasa chaved yichpedu memeni, is rectified in matan, which is giving, which is tzedakah. And that's the consciousness of a person who's going ahead and doing business for the purpose of giving whatever they make away, right? And that's a whole different consciousness than the anxiety of needing to for ourselves, right? A person's thinking, I don't need anything more than I have, right, for my own simcha and for my ashiras kiviyachol. So then the efforts and the shtadlus and parnasa is to be able to give tzedakah. That consciousness of giving is the Tikkun HaKlalli for Tavis Mamon. So Tikkun HaKlalli for really, in a certain way, the whole Shasal Lavin is the iyyun of Pigam, is the iyyun of Tikkun HaBris, and the iyyun of Tikkun HaKlalli for Tavis Mamon is tzedakah, and that's masa umatan, right? That's the aspect of masa umatan. When a person's weighed down by the burden of the Tavis Mamon, how do we rectify that? Matan, right? By giving money. Okay, so let's jump in from where we were yesterday. We'll just go back over this. Tzarich l'sakin tchila Tikkun HaKlalli. It emerges that first and foremost, what's necessary is to rectify the Tikkun HaKlalli, which is the general global tikkun, so to speak, right? Not like global in the world, right? Global in ourselves, right? That meta level tikkun. And then after that, everything else will be rectified. Even though the Tikkun HaKlalli is necessarily going to be more challenging, more difficult, higher level, more intense than fixing up detail by detail by detail, because you're going straight to the top, so to speak. Even so, because being able to rectify anything is tali in the mind, because in order to live a life where a person is staying away from the shasal loisaseh, and a person is davuk in alikim chayim by doing the things that one is supposed to do, and by staying away from the things that one is not supposed to do, that requires moichin. Otherwise, there's no point. Otherwise, nobody's going to do anything. A person needs to have emunah. Without emunah, you can't budge, right? And whatever budging one does without emunah, it's usually for very lowly, this worldly considerations that don't last. A person can stay in the game for kavod for like a few years, but to be in it for the long haul, for a person to mamish be in an iyyun of commitment, you have to believe in it. Otherwise, it'll fizzle. And so it all requires the moichin. Okay, but the problem is you can't have moichin without the Tikkun HaKlalli. So, right, the only way is to go straight to Tikkun HaKlalli, even though that's the more difficult, challenging tikkun. Rabbi Nachman says that's what ought to be focused on first. That's where a person's energies need to be placed, because Rabbi Nachman is all about resolving the source of the problem and not simply focusing on symptoms. And we learned this many times in the past, because that is the consciousness of penimiyus. The chitzonius is always symptoms, right? The penimiyus is, let's find out what's causing all these symptoms, and let's solve the problem at the root, which, like we learned in the past, is usually very different than the symptoms that appear on the surface. Usually it's something else, right? Like we remember, we'll go back to Bereges Rachim Tiskar, right? When a person is behaving poorly, we say instead of seeing rishos, we see somebody who's hurting, right? And if we resolve the hurt, and we can sort of make this person feel okay, and help this person help this person feel loved, and etc., that usually will resolve issues. And that's Beroiges, like we said, Rachim Tiskar. Hashem, instead of getting angry at us, which is the correct response, right, vis-a-vis our behavior on the surface, look deeper and Rachim Tiskar. And instead of reacting with frustration, react with compassion, right? Because instead of looking at the symptom, you look deeper. And that's a Torah that we had earlier. And the same applies over here. The Rebbe says, what is the source of the issue of the Shasal Lavin? And the answer is, it's that we don't have lavnunis min hamayach, is that our consciousness is not clear and our brain is not functioning properly. We live in a state of pigam habris, which means that I think that I lost my covenant with Hashem. I think that the world has no hope, that everything is wasteful. Asher karcha baderech. My brain is cooled off. The whole iyyun is carry. That's the nekuda, like we learned, of Tikkun HaKlalli, right? Where a person writes off all of reality because they make blanket statements. And they talk and talk and talk, right? And they start to unveil all of the darkness of reality. And that requires Tikkun HaKlalli. We have to rectify our generalizations with regard to who we are, the labels that we put on ourselves. I gave I think a pretty important share yesterday in Sichas HaBris. Sorry, Shimon's been with Sichas HaBris for 5 years. Sorry that you missed that particular share, but you catch the recording. But the whole share was that we put labels on ourselves, we limit ourselves. And about Rabbi Nachman wanted every person to know that the madrigas that he reached was not because he was born with some hayach and neshama. He said he just put a lot of effort in. He took it really seriously. And he says again and again, everyone can reach the madriga that I reached. So he says, beferish. We went very, very deeply into that. I think it was an important share. I'm going to send out the link hopefully later today.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
It's not like shot.
Yeah.
Is not going to equate to the two Tikkun HaKlallis, that either you do Tikkun HaBris or you do Tikkun penimiyus, or is he saying Tikkun HaBris is really the ikka one and penimiyus is the second one?
Yeah, it gets a little bit confusing. We'll throw in a third one, is that he's going to say a little bit later that there's maybe another Tikkun HaKlalli. We're going to see. He sort of clarifies that in the next paragraph. Okay, so let's see if you still have the question at the end of the paragraph. It might make it worse, it might make it better, we'll see. Okay, but this is it. A person has to go to the source. Not to live in a state of Tikkun HaKlalli, right? To live in a state of openness and hope and to see the world for the way the world is. There's a lot of bad, there's a lot of good, but not to write things off legami. That's amalek, that's carry. Okay, so a person needs lavnunis min hamayach b'bechinas v'noizlim in levanai. But the only way to do that is through Tikkun HaKlalli, like we learned. What was kinai? Kinai is kinei chachma, kinei bina, abba, ima, the brain. How do you awaken the brain? Yatir kinai. The answer is nesher. What's nesher? Nesher is the ruach. Ruach was like kama ruach beish. That's a reference to Tikkun HaBris. Right? So kinesher yatir kinai. The only way to awaken the mind is that a person should be living in a state of Tikkun HaBris. And again, Tikkun HaBris is going to be on each person's level. So for some people, it's the Meitzar, Meitzar Zelavatala, bifrat. For some people, it's a higher madrega, Shemiras HaBris on the street. It's tznius, a person's sensitivity with regard to where they go and how they interact with women. Right? Even if it's not mamish an inyan of erva. But that's also an akuda. What are people's sensitivities? Are we, just hanging around with other people's, like sometimes in the prevailing culture, I see there's very, very little sensitivity in that area. People are, schmoozing on the street. It's a sensitivity thing. But again, there are levels and levels of madrigas and madrigas, right? And the same is true, by the way. Some women were sending me, it's not so relevant for the woman. It is relevant for the woman. It's true for women as well, right? Even though, again, here we're speaking specifically about Tikkun HaBris. But it goes generally for the whole topic of interactions, right, between men and women and sensitivity in that regard. And there are myriad levels. This is true with regard to the more literal understanding of Tikkun HaBris, but then you take it into a mindset, and it's like amrach, that's relevant literally for anyone, right, where a person guards the concept that they have a covenant with Hashem, and that is the foundation of their consciousness. No matter what they go through, no matter what's going on, that remains ever present. That's called Tikkun HaBris. Right? Again, over here we're using the word bris in the most, I think, original sense, right? Where HaKadosh Baruch Hu's karas bris with, first of all, with Noach, right? And that's HaKadosh Baruch Hu's the keshes, which is the inyan of Ice bris, which is why Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in his days they never saw keshes. That's number one. And then the bris that he made with Avram Avinu, right? That Hashem will be connected to this nation and he'll have a stake in history through this people, etc., etc. So we're talking on many levels, right? And there's something relevant for everybody in this parsha. But that's what comes first. Kinesher Yair Kinoi. And that's what comes first. Bebechinas v'noizl menavalan u'l'roimim hamayach iyavshi gemai Tikkun HaKlalli bebechinas kaneshi yarkinai kanes kalel al kein tzarich leilich mitchila el madrega yoyisrael yoynim izeh. So the first thing that one needs to do is to go to the higher madrega, even though it would appear, well, let's fix up what we have here. And the answer is no. What we're struggling with here is because we're struggling with that there. Right, so again, we don't deal with the symptoms. Let's go to the core. Go to the core. Everything else is rectified. Once that's fixed up, everything else will be fixed up. And over here, we'll mention something that we've mentioned in the past: is that the whole inyan of penimiyus HaTorah is that it flips prevailing notions on their head. And it shows that a lot of things that were prior thought to be effective approaches are not only not effective, they are actually the opposite, right? For example, pressure in chinuch, right? It was assumed that if a person really tries to put pressure on their kids, okay, that makes a mensch out of them. And it turns out that maybe something generationally, maybe it used to work, but on the contrary, the more pressure you put, the more turned off they become, the more they feel that it's oppressive, and they'll follow along all the while that they still feel that you have dominion on them. But the minute that they're free, and off they go. And it doesn't work this way. So it's a delicate balance. That's one example. This is another example. Because according to what we're saying, the consciousness of Tikkun HaBris is for a person to feel loved, for a person to feel that they have a kesher with a Kadosh Baruch Hu no matter what, for a person to be able to deal with the anxiety that they feel in a healthy way, as opposed to needing an outlet where, right, which is often what that iyyun is, especially for children growing up through adolescence. And Tikkun HaBris means we have to get the kriras, that Amalekian shame and debilitating guilt, and a person feeling like there's no hope for them. That is the tikkun of this iyyun. But sometimes the way that we educate is we reinforce the guilt and the shame. And if we ever catch our kid watching, that, or we ever watch doing that, or we, oh my, it's the most dramatic thing in the world, and all hell breaks loose, right? Because the parents think, well, that'll send them a message. Yes, the message that it sends is that it reinforces the very impetus that caused the kid to run to that in the first place. That's not resolving any issue. That is perpetuating the cycle. But in order to understand that, we need the moichin of penimiyus HaTorah, because otherwise it looks logical. This is the issue. It's not an issue, it's a symptom. But this is the issue. This is the response. But if the response to the apparent issue is, while apparently taking care of the problem, but it was never a problem, it was a symptom, and the thing that caused that was the kind of consciousness that you're going to reinforce in dealing with the symptom, then it's punkt verkehrt. It makes the issue worse. And that's why this is so important. That's what Rabbi Nachman is saying. In order to fix up any lav, you need to go to Tikkun HaKlalli, which is Tikkun HaBris, which is, first of all, to get into a better mindset. Forget about, first of all, vis-a-vis the world, which is true, but vis-a-vis one's own self. That's first and foremost. That is the Tikkun HaKlalli, Gesundheit. And although that appears to be on a higher level, got to do that first, because anything else will need to benefit from the lavnunis, from the clarity, from the translucence, from the consciousness of that madrega. So yeah, sometimes you have to skip, be medalik, and then memela, everything else is rectified. Memela, everything else will be fixed up. So now we go back to the Sabbath Be'atuna with which we began that story, right? Which was the story where the Sabbath Be'atuna asked Reb Yeshua ben Hanania, why would a person who's rejected from a particular shidduch as a result of not being on the level, why would he then go to a family that's more miyuchas, right? And somehow like that would work. Reb Yeshua ben Hanania took a peg and he tried to stick it into the wall, on the bottom of the wall where there was no hole, there was no crack, it didn't go in. And then he lifted it up and he found a hole higher up on the wall and he stuck it in and the taka went in. And he said, because it could be that although on a this worldly level, the shidduch didn't work for this worldly considerations, maybe Klape Shmaya, that was taka his mazel, right? That was bar mazle, that was his shidduch. And that's the way that he answered that question. Said Rabbi Nachman, what does this mean? Al pi penimiyus was that perish hagaber da alzabai itzar, a person who goes seeking after a woman, after a wife, but the family did not give the girl to this person because he wasn't on the level of yichos. Says Rabbi Nachman, what's being referred to? Hainu bechinas isha yiras Hashem. What kind of woman is he seeking? What kind of shidduch? In Isha Yiras Hashem, it's referring to Malchus. Malchus, Yiras Hashem, meaning a Malchus to Kedusha, a garment of translucence where a person is able to experience Hashem's presence throughout daily life. Hanumisha Pagam Ba'avonos, a person who's struggling with all kinds of different things. V'garan damnida l'shchina k'niskala el, and causes therefore damnida to the Shechina separated from Kudsha Baruch Hu. Shal yedeza nachash mashach la, like we learned, the nachash draws Chava toward him, and that's the iyyun of Chava's Malchus, the first feminine principle. Then that's a period being Kudsha Baruch Hu Shchinte. And there's a period, and now he's seeking, how do I reclaim Malchus? How do I reclaim Yiras Shamayim? That Yiras Mamish, as we're going to see, is Malchus. But it didn't work. HaKadosh Baruch Hu roars over the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. We lost it. We lost the Malchus of Hashem, the kingship of Hashem in the world. The palace is destroyed. So they said, what is the reason that he would go and try to work on something that's even more challenging, that's something that's even more advanced? Why would you jump to something more advanced if they don't have the basics? It's like a very familiar question when people are spending time learning penimiyus HaTorah, right? Hopefully, again, must be in balance with nigla, right? I'm sure everybody here has sidarim and nigla. Obviously one can't go with the other. If this is your only learning of the day, that's the opposite of what Rabbi Nachman wanted, right? Balance is the key, and so a person has to have a in some form halacha, Tanakh. Person has to be learning nigla HaTorah without a question. That goes without saying, obviously. But people want to know, person's jumping to penimiyus HaTorah. Deal with the basics first. A person, is Amma Aretz and Halacha. What business do they have opening up Sifrei Chasidus? Sifrei Chasidus, the principle of Chasidus. Lo Amma Aretz Chasid. So how does a person go? And the answer, of course, is like, I think it was one of the Zidichev Rebbe's, maybe the Baal, is there Sefer Eitz Hadas Tov Ram? I think. The Zidichev Rebbe. I think it was one. I think so. One of the early Rebbes of Zidichev was asked, how could a person learn Kabbalah before he's Ra'oi? Because he was a big proponent. He believed, if I'm not mistaken, that 9-year-olds should begin already learning principles of penimiyus. 9 years old. So how could a person learn penimiyus if they're not Ra'oi? So Zidichev said, how will anybody ever be Roy unless they learn penimiyus? Right? So, and it's a very similar model here. It's like, yeah, you're right, it's more advanced, but the only way that I'll ever get the basics is if I find something more advanced. Otherwise, I'll never have love nunis in my mayach. And so, yeah, we have to teach this to high schoolers. We can't wait. Otherwise, they'll never get to where they're supposed to get. And so this is the question. My chaza, the azal heichel limit lamine. Excuse me. How does that make sense? While he's trying to fix the consciousness that will enable him to do mitzvahs and stay away from averos. And in order to do that, he jumps to Tikkun HaKlalli Yiras Hashem, which is higher than the iyyun of Malchus, but bechinas tzaddik moishel b'yiras alikim, that yiras alikim is a reference to Malchus, and tzaddik is Shemiras HaBris. But tzaddik is Yesod. Malchus is lower than Yesod. And so a person is trying to work on gaining an appreciation for the Gedalyah, for the godliness that's here on this level of Malchus, right, the Asiya. And that's not working out, so he jumps to Yesod. Yesod is higher up. Tzaddik moishel b'yiras alikim. Yiras alikim is Malchus, alikim malkim ikadem. Yira, as we're going to see in a minute, is a reference to Malchus. Tzaddik is on a higher madrega. Ki tzaddik shebechinas Tikkun HaKlalli hu lemala. Because Amru Malchus is always related to Yira. Like the Mishnah Abba says, Il Mali Ma'ira'a Shal Malchus, right? If it were not for fear of government, then each person would swallow up his friend, right? It's a staunchly anti-anarchic sentiment, right? We need governance. What kind of governance? Big question. But there needs to be a governmental structure. There needs to be law and order. Otherwise, it's not going to work. But you see over here, there's a correlation between Mayra'a, Yira, and Malchus. So Tzaddik Moishel be Yiras Elikim, which is a reference to Malchus. Tzaddik Yisod is higher. So how did he answer? Siksa is like needles and pegs. Rashi. This is a reference to Divrei Torah, which is a reference to the communication or lack thereof of our physical world, which was created with the Torah. So Bara Alma, we know that the whole entire world and creation reality is composed of code. And we can understand that today very well with modern technology, with code, numbers, strings of code. Because in Lashon HaKodesh, I mentioned this in the past, numbers are letters. And so the Gemara says that but through the lens of modern technology, you realize he didn't just know the letters through which heaven and earth are created. The letters are numbers. It's math. An amazing thing. But Salel knew the code of reality. He knew what codes this experience of VR that we consider to be very real. He knew the code. But the code is the letters, and the letters are the letters of the Torah Kedusha. The world is created with the Diburei Torah, and the Torah is what gives life to the world. The Torah is the code of reality. So that's a reference to Divrei Torah Kamashakasav, because the pasuk says in Kehal Divrei Chachamim Kidarvaino Suchamasmeres, that the words of the Chachamim also are like pegs, like needles. See, he took this peg, which is a reference to Divrei Torah, and Datza Lasata, and he tried to push it in on the bottom of the wall. He tried to rectify Divrei Torah, which is a communicative reality, which is Yichud Kutchabrichu Shchinte, that the world should speak, that the world should communicate Divrei Emes, that it should be a bechina of Malchus to Kedusha, that it should be a bechina of Chen Ha'amiti, going back to Torah Aleph. But bechinas Basar the Istalik. Right, Tikkun HaKlalli, bechinas Basar the Istalik Rabbi Shimon Shaz HaDibur Aser, but the world it didn't go because there was no Tikkun HaKlalli, and we learned that in the time of no Tikkun HaKlalli, Dibur Aser, which Al Pi Pshat in this context means that the whole world is not communicating its godliness. Dibur Aser, the Dibur, this that Hashem is communicating with us through reality, is Asur, is Kashur, is bound up, is tied, is blocked, is prevented from revealing itself. And the person was not able to speak words of Torah, was not able to communicate words of positivity, and it was all negative. It was all hopeless. But then Tikkun HaKlalli, even though it's a higher level, it's the bechin of Yesod, Sha'az HaDibur Mutter, and then everything opened up, and all of a sudden the wall that looked impenetrable, this is actually Shaykh, I believe what it was, Tarchaf. I can't remember anymore. Tarchaf Dalet. No, Tarchaf Hey, where we learned in the beginning over there about the Shamir worm. Remember? That the whole inyan of the Shamir is that it's able to split reality, that what looks like an impenetrable obstacle that communicates nothing, all of a sudden is revealed as having cracks and crevices, and the light is able to shine through. Meitzitz menacharakim, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu peers out through the cracks in the wall. The wall, those cracks is a reference to the kaisa, right? There are cracks in the wall through which HaKadosh Baruch Hu is peering out. And so the same thing over here. All of a sudden, if you move to a higher madrega, yes, then we can rectify our perspective on reality, where it's not as impenetrable as it appears. Sha'az HaDibur Mutter, and then the world is communicative, and the Leiv HaEven, Kiviyachal, objectively turns into the Leiv Basar, and it's not a heart of stone; it's split open.
It's interesting that the Keshes was a bris that was given to Bnei Noach. So we're saying, in a sense, when the world is not able to take the Eloikus at the level of Torah Sinai, it means we have to somehow go back to a lower common denominator.
Amazing, beautiful. I mean, remember, Tikkun HaBris it's part of the Shev Mitzvahs B'nei Noach. That's one of the relationships. And that iyyun, if seen as a broad category, so then all of this is shaykh to every single human in the world. And it could be a bechina of derech eretz kadmon l'Torah, but it's also an important part of Torah itself. But yes, you see that there. Listen, the Mabul came as an account of immorality. So, in a certain sense, it's higher, right? Because it's more, like you're saying, it's more primordial, it's more fundamental, it's a foundation, right? Derech eretz could be, even itself can be seen as a reference to Shemiras HaBris, right? Derech, the Gemara in Kiddush says, is always a reference to bris, right? Kein derech isha min ha'efes, right? Kederech. The word derech is always in the context of kederech kol anashim. Actually, we had it last week's parsha. I noticed kederech kol anashim is in the aspect of Lot's daughters, and over there the word derech is there, right? In reference to, right, that they will not be able to have regular relationships. Kederech kol olam, whenever the lashon is over there, and eretz is malchus. So it's possible to suggest derech eretz, yisod malchus, is kadmon l'Torah. It's higher, but it's more fundamental. Hainu sheher lehem, he showed to them that the way is to praise tzadikim. Shu Tikkun HaKlalli lahadibur. Now you see, it's another element. Now there's a Tikkun HaKlalli for dibur, and then there's a Tikkun HaKlalli for money, tzedakah. Then there's a Tikkun HaKlalli for bris, right? Or that whole area, or really all the lavin, which is Tikkun HaBris. So v'hu adin kol advarim efshar l'sakin ki im al yidei Tikkun HaKlalli kedei laharem es hamayach shemisham nimshach kol alav nunis keniska le'al. So Rabbi Yehuda was asking a really good question, and I had this slight confusion as I'm learning here, that on the one hand he seems to say that all the shasal lavin, right, are bound up with this ultimate gid, right? Because the 365 gidim, right, is wrapped up into the ultimate gid, which is vayaged lachem es brisai, and that's the iyyun of Tikkun HaBris, right? And that would appear to cover everything, maybe even Bris Mamon, right? Meaning that's also included, because 365 alavin, there's nothing more, there's nothing less. But then the Rebbe says that there's a Tikkun HaKlalli for Bris Mamon, and now he's saying, right, which is tzedakah. Now he's saying that there's a Tikkun HaKlalli for dibur, which is shevach tzadikim. So it's hard. It's a little bit challenging to know how that works, unless it's possible to suggest that it's sort of in stages. Meaning, along the journey toward the Tikkun HaKlalli Sheva Klali, which is Tikkun HaBris, that's the ultimate Yisayid and the ultimate Gid Vayaged Lechem Es Brisai, Koilol all the Shasa Lavin and the Shasa Gidin. First and foremost is to rectify Dibur, and that's Shevach Tzadikim. Then Tzedakah, and slowly but surely, it's like cluster by cluster, a person works their way up to the ultimate cluster. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out as a suggestion. But tzarich iyyun. It could be the other way, but the reason why not? No, the reason why not the other way is that if you get to the Tikkun HaKlalli of bris, so then there's nothing left to fix. Meaning we don't know. We know that the Tikkun of bris includes all the lavin. We don't know that the Tikkun of dibur or the Tikkun of Mamon covers everything else. So I'm suggesting, right, you work your way up, but tzarich iyyun. But at least what comes out from this is that there are three very important tikkunim, which are bris, mamon, and dibur. And he said this person also, when he finds this new family that's more miyuchas, because it was the mazel. It was his mazel. Says the Rebbe, this is the aspect of opening the tap, so to speak, opening the tap of one's brain, one's mind, the bechinas, v'noizlim min levanayin, which is the flowing down of the consciousness from levanayin, which is libuna demoicha, and that's hainami isram yolei bas mazle. That although al pi pshat, it means, because that was his mazel, and he went, this family wasn't a mazel, that family was the mazel. Rabbi Nachman sees the word mazel as noizel, which is the aspect of the flowing down of the mentality. He used speech as an example. And he used dibur as an example of that which can only be rectified with Tikkun HaKlalli. When Rabbi Shimon was alive, so then the dibur was al tikunai. Ubasur des stalig nemar al titan es bichalachti es besarecha. So first he pushed it in on the bottom of the wall. That's what he says. All things need to be rectified with the Tikkun HaKlalli that is shaykh to it. Kigoyin maso matan is going to be ayidei tzedakah. V'chein kulam tzarich l'sakin kol davar ayidei Tikkun HaKlalli hashayach lai. There's a machmash tzarich l'harim hasamaychen, because a person needs to elevate their consciousness lahamshich misham lavnunis, so that they'll be operating out of a space of clarity and consciousness. L'sakin l'labin kol ha'pegamim, to fix up all of the pegamim. So he stays very vague on the Tikkun HaKlalli of Bris, right? So what does that mean? Everything has its Tikkun HaKlalli, right? But Bris is the ultimate Tikkun HaKlalli. So that leads to the question: if a person rectifies Bris, then the chayra, there's nothing else to fix up. So it's tzarich. This is
Bris is the main one, because he fleshed out a lot about how that gets into everything.
Sure.
But if you don't have Bris, you can't have Dibbur. So how can you be Masakin Tikkun Dibbur if you don't have Bris yet?
Right, and then again, once a person's Masakin Bris, then why is there Dibbur to fix up?
Right.
Okay, that's maybe our first tzarich. I think I'll do some digging on that. And it channels down the libuna demoicha, the whiteness in the brain. Then the Rebbe Gedalyah Kodesh leaves a very enigmatic 4 words, which is a pasuk in Mishlei that says kesef nivchar lashon tzaddik. The words of a tzaddik are like kesef nivchar. They're like refined, choice silver. And he puts little dashes here, because this is Lashon Rabbeinu, I believe, right? This is Rabbi Nachman's... Oh, this is not Rabbi Nachman's words, no. Okay, but this is what he said. He finished off the iyyun by just saying these 4 words. And the reference was to the Sofet Tevis, which spell franc. Pei, Reish, Nun, Kuf, which is Yiddish for France. And then Reb Nassan says, Be'erzah iyyun, to explain this, what shaykh is this pasuk has, he's bar b'makam acher, will be explained elsewhere. That elsewhere is a reference to Likutei Moharan, where Reb Nassan explains the following. And with this, I'm going to read to you from this sefer, which brings down all of the other information that isn't actually in the Torah. And I would have read it in the beginning, but I wanted to save it for now because now it becomes more relevant. So let me read this to you. Torah zu nemra b'shvuas tavkov samach vav b'Breslov. This was a shvuas Torah. Shechal ba'is hashana b'yimei shishi v'Shabbos. That fell that year on Friday and Shabbos. U'b'chayim Moharan muva'is in Chayim Moharan ois Chof. It's brought kama sichas hashayachas l'Torah, a number of anecdotal, biographical pieces, information with regard to this particular lesson. And this is what he says. It was at that time in Rabbi Nachman's life, Tavkov Samach Vav, Lavash Pamrishan Begadim Lavanim. Rabbi Nachman wore all white. Toward the end of his life, Rabbi Nachman changed. He would only wear white clothing. And so he gave a Torah on white clothing, right? And why he started to dress in white, iyyun sham, right? Which is the Torah that we learned. And at that same Maimud was a person who had brought his daughter to Rabbi Nachman for a bracha because she was suffering from epilepsy, from neifel. And someone else had brought Rabbi Nachman wine. And Rabbi Nachman said the Torah that was a Torah zmanis, right? It was a Torah about everything that was happening. And he was koilel all of the considerations of those who were there at that Maimid into this drasha, seeing Torah encoded into the experience of reality that he was having. Reb Nassan says many wondrous things that we saw with our own eyes, right? Aside from all the really hidden things, Ki etzem kavanasa b'chlal b'frat ef shel hasig, because we're in good company. Apparently, it's impossible to understand, right, the essence of what he meant. Gam amra Torah azos hamedes halat sarfas. He said this Torah is also speaking about France. Ki medaber shami kesef u'mammon, because over there we're speaking a lot about money. Hanemi'in in Tikkun HaKlalli shalamasu maton, which is, I guess, the Indian then of French culture, which is always interested in money. V'chei medaber shami Tikkun HaDibbur al yidei shevach hatzadikim, rectifying speech through praising the tzaddikim, umi begadim levanim, and from white clothing. V'zeh kesef nivchar lashon tzadik. This pasuk that is nichlal kesef, right? Masamatan lashon, which is speech, and the French were famous, of course, for their poetry, and Dibbur is very prominent in that part of the world. Tzadik is Bris, is Sefer Tevis, France. Then Rabbi Nosson continues, but I say Eisha Amar Maimer Anal, in that time that Rabbi Nachman said this Torah, Hayla Ish Echad Ashir, Me Anshe Rabbeinu Zal, Eze Esek Im Adoinim B'Venezia, Me Anshe Chayil Shal Akira, Kesar, Yarim Hoydai. At that time there was one of the wealthy Hasidim of Rabbi Nachman, had some kind of business dealing or court case, at that time a business dealing with soldiers in Venezia, who were soldiers of the Kesar, generals. He had a flour mill, he was supplying them with flour, and something went wrong with the deal, and the flour wasn't maybe as refined as they thought it might be, or it was delayed, something went on. And they wanted to kill him. And it was incredibly dangerous. Aside from the loss of money, he was dealing with mamish, with loss of life. And he was present. It was Shasha Amra Beinu Zala Maimer Anal. And when Rabbi Nachman said over this Torah, Nichnas Beliba Ma'oid Mashim Avur Sham, he really took it to heart. Right? Sha'al Yedei Shevach HaTzadikim HaDibbur Nishma V'Niskabel. The Rabbi Nachman said in the beginning of the Torah that if a person wants his words to be accepted, he has to rectify Dibbur by praising Tzadikim. And we learned what it meant there in our derech of interpretation, but he took it just al pi pshat, pshitas. Kizek kol inyanai. And this is mamish what he needed. Because he's going to go and he's going to try to defend himself, and it needs to be accepted in front of the board or whatever it is, in front of the court. So b'tekiv b'matzah shavuos, he mamish heard this because it was speaking directly to him. And immediately after Shavuos Nasal Venezia, he traveled to Venezia and along the journey, Asak Rak L'Saper B'Shivchei Rabbeinu Zal. He just the whole time was just speaking about the Shevach of the Tzaddik. And then when he came to the city of Venezia, Asak L'Saper L'Fnei Balas Achsania Shalei Harbe B'Shivchei Rabbeinu Zal. He sat with his host and he was praising the Tzaddik. Everybody just had so much to say. There was so much to say about this tzaddik. And then, after having done that, he came before these people, the soldiers, and he said all of his tainus, and they heard him. And they accepted his words. They kiblu said v'chabed gadol, and they received him with great honor. And nitzal mikol sakanas, and he got out of all the danger. V'yatsa b'shalom and ha'esek hanal karoi. So you see, he took this al pi pshat, and you see the way that Rabbi Nachman, when he said a Torah, was referencing the lived experience of those around the table, and he utilized all of their life circumstances to become part and parcel of the Torah. So that's what he says over there, and then he brings. Over here, commenting on the end of the Torah, over here, the Indian of Frank. So he says, it's brought in the Sefer Ibei Anachal, which is one of the primary commentaries on the Likutei Moharan. Excuse me, Mevur, Ba'amaisa Shal Bal Tefillah. There's a story of the Bal Tefillah. This is the 12th story in SHIURIM Meitzar. Ma'aseh Bal Tefillah. And it's a whole story over there how the whole world is totally in in the mistaken delusion of the various values, the things that are important. And they split into kingdoms that value different shtiyot, right? This one values Tavas Nashim, right? That's the most important thing. And they choose for themselves a very beautiful queen, a very beautiful woman. This one says strength is the most important thing, and they get a big warrior to be their king. This one values poetry, and they find a poet. This one values money, and so on, right? And the whole world is like this. And okay, Ayin Sham, it's an incredible satire on contemporary culture, particularly when he describes the kingdom of wealth, which is mamish, the capitalistic society. Ayin Sham. But there's one kingdom, Sha'amru she'ikra tachlis hu hadibur, that the most important thing is dibur, right? Is fine speech. Umatsu, Rabbi Nachman writes over there, they found Tzarfati Meshuga, a crazy Frenchman, right? Who the whole time just walking around the whole day, he was a bard, he was an orator, but he was mad, he was a crazy person. But because the thing that they appreciated most was speech, it didn't matter what he did, he could speak really well, he was a crazy person. So they found the crazy Frenchman, right? Shahaya Makir Kamal Shoinus, who knew how to speak many languages, and they instituted him as the king. So Mavur Mizah, we find over there, Shetzarfat hu Dibbur de Sitra Achra, that France is the Indian of Dibbur de Sitra Achra, meaning it's a Dibbur that comes from madness, because the whole Torah that we're learning is that Dibbur should come from Moichin, right? And when Dibbur comes from Moichin, it's not a matter of how many poems you could produce or even how many books you could write. It's a matter of Emor Ma'at and Aseh Harbeh, right? Because it's guided by Moichin. But the Tzarfati Meshuga is busy with millions of poems, you know, and Dibbur de Sitra Achra, Hefech Mikol HaTikkunim HaMavo'ar B'Torah Hanal, which is Tikkun HaBris, Tikkun Dibbur, Tikkun Das. V'zeh Yachol Kamal L'Shoinus, U'Pekam HaDibbur, Ki L'Shoinus L'Shoin Ilgim, and you knew all the languages, but it's nothing. U'Meshuga U'Pekam HaDas, right? And that's what I just said. Ve'ikra Shigoyno Al Dei Pekam HaBris. Nimtza Shat Tzarfatim, this is like, right, the French, Sorry if anybody has French lineage, right? He says the French are mamish. All these tikkunim over there in French culture is the opposite of all this. The Sophatevis, which is like the Acharayim of all of this, is France. Right, and this is the tikkun for all of this, and also at that same time, right? See, he was making reference to the downfall of Napoleon, which he believed, right? There was a big split among the tzaddikim, some were pro, some were anti, and Napoleon had his downfall. Okay, again, soidus noraim, not getting into politics now or national sensitivities, but this is the Rebbe is trying to bring out a point, right? We have to understand, what Kedusha is and what the opposite of Kedusha is. And a culture of a voluptuous culture, of a voluptuary culture, which is all about physical delights, whether it's eating, right? Whether it's love, whether it's sensuality, arts, and so on. Right? I think that's true. I think that's objectively true. That's what that culture is associated with. And the Rebbe is trying to teach us, like, Yiddishkeit is literally the hepech of all of that. It's the inyan of moichin. It's the inyan of dibur, that's dibur amiti. Okay, 5 minutes left. Let's do our best to cover the next paragraph. I said we would try to finish. We've schlepped this Torah on, and we have to move on to Torah Lamed, which is calling out to us. Can't you hear it? Torah Lamed is mamish begging us to learn it. So we have to go through this. Okay, this paragraph that we're going to learn is incredibly dense. I'm going to try to make my way through it. It's quite complex, but b'siyata d'shmaya, we will have kvitzas haderech. Shaykh la'os ches. This is shaykh to os ches, which had to do with the wine, right? This is why a woman, says Rabbi Nachman, whose damim is merubim, who's suffering from some kind of condition where she cannot have a regular set period, even though yayin, we learned earlier, is a bechin of dam nida, bechinas yayin ki is adam, that's going to cause her more dam, shacharisai dam, which is the aspect of causing more dam, but bechinas nichnas yayin yatsasoid kaniskal el, which is the hepech of tikkun of dam. Im kol zeh rifu asa, it is possible for it to be healed ayidei yayin shehistakel boit tzadik amiti, that when the tzaddik amiti looks at wine and she drinks that wine, that's the tikkun. Because what did we say about the iyyun? Loy zacha is nasa rosh. That's the inyan of dam. But zacha nasa rosh. There could be a yichud between yayin and a person's consciousness. Eyes is the aspect of consciousness, right? Like we learned now a number of times, as a reference to Adam and Chava becoming wise, right? After they ate from the Eitz Hadas Tova, their eyes opened up, which is machshava. And so when the tzaddik's eyes look at the cup of wine is the inyan of malchus. They're getting to the whole depth of that, right? But the cup, the kli, is the inyan of malchus. And when the eyes look into the wine, it's a gevaldige yichud chachman malchus, and it's able to turn it into malchus to kedusha. This is why Friday night it's a big inyan to look into the wine, and if a person can see their reflection, is also a big inyan. Parenthetically, it's possible. Oh boy, I'm getting myself into trouble. We have to get through this, but I'll just mention this amazing thing. Why is it? Where did this skula come from? That if a person can see their reflection, it's brought in Svarim. That's a big skula. I don't know, but I was thinking that it's possible. A person shouldn't be shaking, when they say, meaning you can only see a reflection in the cup of wine if you're extremely still. And that means, to what extent has Shabbos really come into your whole bones? If you're ready to say Kiddush and you're standing completely Shabbosdik, then you should be able to see your reflection. Okay, going right there, that's the inyan of Nichnas Yayin Yatzasayid. When the tzaddik looks at the wine, that could be a tikkun. Okay, Rabbi Nachman says that there's a connection between eyes, eyesight, and hair. Because it says in the Tikkun HaKlalli that there are 7 layers upon the eyes. The eyes is covered with 7 layers, like layers of an onion, of whatever material it is that is covering over the essential eyeball. And this is a reference to the 7 braids of Shimshon. And that's the aspect of the moichin. Because sa'ar's hair, which we're learning is connected to eyesight, is connected to the brain. Because we learn that the hair is moichin, right? It emerges from the brain. That's why there are 7 braids on Shimshon's head, which correlate to the 7 aspects of the eye, which also are going to impact the 7 midos, which is our taivas, which are going to have an impact on the way that we see the world. Because like we learned, a person's consciousness will be, right, in accordance with Kenesha Ya'ir Kinai or Goizel Avivi Imai, right? It'll be in accordance with our actions. That's how clean and cleansed his brain will be. Right? The 7 midos will machlefais roisha, right? They will impact our consciousness. But when Shimshon was paigim in the Sa'ara, he gave away his secret, right? That it relies on his hair. And Nifka Maria, we know Shimshon halach achar einav, which is the inyan of Bris, right? Like it says in the Gemara in Saita, which is complicated because in one place it refers to him as a tzaddik, and in one place it refers to him not so much so good. She shiva gilda eina akin Shimshon shepagam b'shiva machlefes roisha. He was paigim in those braids. Nemar bay vayinakru plishtem as einav, right? Therefore, it's going to come back to affect the eyes. When a person rectifies their eyes, which we learned doesn't just mean to not to look at erva, right? But that we rectify the way that we look upon the world. That fixes up our moichin, right? And that brings about the aspect of whiteness. That turns the unnaturally stained wool, that red wool, it turns it into whiteness. That's the reference to the white hair, so to speak, of Atik Yoimin. Shu malvish adminius, that it whitens the redness shalash sagidin, and it rectifies that inyan of the begadim of b'chinas imyadimu katoila, even if it'll become red, right, like a toila, like this red thread kat Tzemer yihu. It will be transformed into Tzemer. Nimsad emerges and is staken al yidei zeh ha'admimius, that through this fixing up the eyes, which is going to rectify our braids, so to speak, our hair, which is a reference to the moyach, through this it will bring about the inyan of Tzemer, right? The white hair kiviyachol of that higher level, which is a higher level of consciousness, shehu b'chinas dam nida k'niska le'el, which is a reference to dam nida, and the unnatural stained wool that becomes red returns to its natural state, which is white. And the world that unnaturally shuts Hashem out kiviyachol begins to reveal naturally the Creator, and we can see things for what they are. Meitzar karasika. The way to get out of Meitzar, which is a constricted mindset, which is Tikkun HaKlalli, is Tzemer, is to turn the Meitzar into Tzemer, to turn the unnaturally stained wool, right, which is red, which is the kesem of dam nida, which is separation kuchabrichu. It should turn into Tzemer kamuva b'kavanas, as it's written in Kavanas Arizal Ayin Sham v'Havin Hadron Alach tzarich of Tes v'Hadron Chalan. What a journey! What a journey! What a journey! Spend the rest of your life in tzarich of Tes, but we shall begin be'ezras Hashem Tar Lamed tomorrow morning. Yeshakach. Thank you everybody for joining. Have a wonderful day. Ani haben v'ata ha'av sheli shekol kach ohev oti ha'av sheli melech chai v'kayam al kol neshima she'ani